Greetings all, Dr. Garrett here, along with Dr. Harbison,
Howdy.
and we are on our movement segment for the Kin Corner. And this week we're going to be discussing the squat. It's the long-awaited, highly controversial movement, which is the squat. And we're going to get into the purpose, the variations, some of the loading, the common faults, as we have in previous videos for these exercise demos or these exercise discussions, rather. But we are going to give you the 5-minute version. This is the quick and the dirty, touching on all the high points, but we'll go into a longer version of that. So I'm gonna physically show you that I am setting a timer for 5 minutes. So we got 5 minutes, here we go.
Jump in.
I'm gonna pull up a few images here, and as I do that, Dr. H, go ahead and start going into the purpose for the squat.
Yeah, so at the very root level, I see the squat as a loaded. It's technically hip flexion and extension, but it's loading the hip and knee extensors. Like we talk about the musculature, right? It's hip and knee extensor musculature driven. So we typically refer to this as kind of a lower body push or a push dominant movement. So we're loading up muscles that would work in patterns similar to running, jumping, kind of pushing or driving. And so it's a great way to provide as much external resistance as you would want to any of those types of movements.
Yep. And for me, in addition to that, of course, I also like the psychological component to this, which is, man, if you've ever squatted heavy and you're at the bottom of a squat, it's miserable and oftentimes even scary. With something like a deadlift, you can bail on it. With something a power clean, you can just dump it and let go. Whereas things like a squat and a bench press, you don't get that choice, especially if you're training alone. It's a lot more intimidating. So there's a psychological component that I like to it as well, which we'll go forward with and expand upon in the long variation. But that's that's one of my favorite things about a squat, outside of just the movement alone, and it being a very natural, very kind of like foundational exercise for sure. So let's talk quickly about some of the variations. There's this is, again, highly debated and often argued. So go ahead and give me some of your variations there.
Yeah, so I mean, going from left to right, I think the picture does a great job of illustrating kind of the major variations or the most common ones that we would see. So at the far left here on this picture, we have what we'd call a goblet squat, which is essentially kind of a dumbbell version of the squat typically. Then the next picture to the right, a front squat. Then further to the right, a high bar back squat, or kind of more of an Olympic style squat. And then furthest to the right, we have the low bar back squat, or more of a powerlifting type squat setup. So there are certainly other ways to squat. I mean, the Zercher squat, the belt squat, there's the overhead squat. There's plenty of other versions. There's a million variations of these. All of them have their own purposes and their own strengths and weaknesses, perhaps. As with anything with training, it's what's the goal, what are you training for, and work your way backwards to determine what's the best application to meet that.
Mm-hmm. Now, if you had, maybe we'll save this for the long form, but if you had one variation, which would you pick and why?
Let's get into that in the long form. I think
I was trying to bait them, folks. I was trying to bait them.
Not today. Yeah. Let's keep this quick. I know there's a timer going.
Yep.
I'll say this: they all have value, and they're
Yep.
all going to stress slightly different aspects of whether it's maximally working more towards the hip or the knee. So if we kind of start left to right, so kind of the far right version is more hip dominant. The far left is going to be more knee dominant or
Yep.
quad dominant. So that's kind of how I would break that down. And again, depending on your goal, choose the application that fits that the best.
Yep. And then in addition to those other variations, like you were alluding to, is like this power Olympic or standard squat stance, in addition to the overhead front and back squat. So loading, for me, I'll kick that one off. Simple progressive overload. Do a little bit more today than you did yesterday in general. So again, there's a lot of nuance to that, but as far as starting a squat, start conservative here. If you are looking to train over the long term and kind of build strength the right way, it's start light and then build over time. There's no need to find your 1RM. If you go to a gym and they say, hey, we're going to find 1RMs today, and it's your first day in the gym, you got a problem. And if you're the trainer prescribing that, you got a problem. So be simple, be safe. Remember, this is like the medical field. Do no harm. We don't want to injure our athletes or our population. So start conservative here and know that you can build over time.
Yep, I think that's well said. I think There's applications depending on what your goal is. If you want to stick with a barbell, a dumbbell, external resistance of whatever kind, there's a lot of different ways to do that. But traditionally, and for good reason, I would say the barbell is kind of the king associated with the squat because, as I mentioned earlier, this is the easiest way that we can add overload. And you mentioned the idea of progressive overload, of continuing to add weight to the bar. It's more and more difficult trying to hold a heavier and heavier dumbbell
Hmm.
and get into that rack position, whereas a barbell really allows us to do that well. So loading, I think, is let's stick with the barbell in most cases for the squat. What are some of the errors that you typically see, or what are the most common errors that you see, Levi?
Perfect. We just hit our timer. So I'm going to give you those real quick. Common errors are going to be flex spine and then an overly knee or shin angle that's too positive. So the actual angle of the ankle and shin is at a point where the heels may be encouraged to come off the ground. So I guess simpler terms, it would be a flex spine and heels coming off the ground. Those are two that I see quite commonly. How about you?
Yeah, I think anytime we look at a movement that loads the trunk, such as the deadlift or the squat, we have to be. I think priority number one has to be on neutral spine and protecting the spine. So that's the main one. Certainly, is avoiding any deviations away from a neutral position
Mhm.
or significant deviations away. Certainly agree the knees are a common point of error there, whether it's a valgus stress where the knees collapse inwards. We'll certainly get into maybe some cueing and coaching for how to drive the feet outwards and things like that when we talk about this long form. But yeah, errors at the knee, errors at the spine. I think there's oftentimes errors in terms of kind of bar path shifting one way or the other and kind of getting out over the toes. We'll get into that as well. There's a lot of beginning mistakes that are made. Um, and there's some easy ways to coach those and fix those. But as long as we're keeping the trunk neutral and the knees where they should be, most people can do a pretty good job squatting if you can cover those two basics.
Sweet. So that's the quick and easy version, but of course these things need nuance, and so we will be going more longer form here in the next variation. Thank you guys.